What up, and welcome. I'm Matthew Msengati, the designer and developer. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Coded Design, where I teach coding and user interface design. In this video, I want us to talk about the request response cycle. As we are about to develop a school management system, it is very important for you to understand how does the request response cycle journey take place. So in any web application, it's different from a desktop application. A web-based application has got a disjointed architecture. So meaning that it is divided into three layers. The first layer being the user interface, the second layer being the business logic, and the last layer being the database management system. However, the business logic and the database management system, at least they are close together, but the front end, which is the user interface, and the business logic, they are like loosely coupled. So they've got some channels of communication, they've got some protocols in which they use to communicate, but they are distinctly and separate entities. So in this video, I want to explain first how does that request response cycle is completed, and at the same time I want us to discuss, or I want to show you how am I going to create an application that will serve as a base application for the school management system. However, some people, they don't go through this route because they usually use PHP frameworks like Laravel. So their production process speeds up and it becomes quicker because they don't create their own some sort of small framework for their application. So in this course, I'm not going to use any framework, and also I'm going to create some sort of a mini version of my own framework, the one that is going to take care of the request response cycle, so that when I'm creating the school management system, I can create that on top of that small framework. So growing up in 90s, I didn't have a luxury of my mother or my father buying shoes for me, school shoes, twice or thrice a year. So I only had one chance a year. That means if that shoe is torn, then it will mean that I have to get a new skill or to acquire a new skill of sewing my own shoe. So I want to explain in detail and clearly to you a request response cycle in terms of the process of sewing a shoe. Let's say that we've got two leather surfaces, the top one and the bottom one. So the idea when we are sewing, we want to mend the two, to combine the two. So as you can see here, we've got a shoe needle and we've got a thread, a sewing thread. So there is a sewing thread above the top layer, and also there is a sewing thread beneath the top layer. So what you will usually do, as you can see first, that the sewing thread is the shoe needle is different from the cloth needle. So the shoe needle has got a hook at the edge or on top so that it can hook this thread. So the idea is that you take the two layers that you are interested in combining or mending, and then you will push your needle through so that its edge is above this sewing thread, and then from there you will pull it down so that it pulls down the sewing thread that was on top so that it can be at the bottom. This part acts as a hole that has been opened by the needle. So if we can go back to slide number 1, this process of pushing your needle through these surfaces, it's a request. It's like you are requesting for something, you are asking for it. But now, then when you've managed to hook the thread on top and you pull it downwards, then that's your response. As you can see that the hook of the needle was empty when you were requesting something, but now that you are pulling it down, it came down with a thread. So that thread acts as a response. And then what you will do then, you will take the edge or this edge of this thread, and then you have to put it in the middle of the thread that was above, as you can see here. So the next step is to push it through, and then from there, once you are done with that, you have to remove your needle from hooking the thread. And then from then, obviously you will pull this thread from this side and also this one to that side. And then after that, as you can see that the top part, the top layer and the second layer now is bound together. Obviously that happened because you've been pulling this thread this side upward, and also you were pulling this side downward. And then after that, you will repeat the same process, and that will mean that you are also requesting again. So what is the takeaway from this analogy? Number one, as you can see, the needle moves up and down in the same direction. It moves up empty and it comes back with a thread, moves up empty and it comes back with a thread. In the process, the sewing occurs, or the top layer and the bottom layer are getting mended together. So how does this relate to a request response cycle? Number one, what you need to know: the web technology is not like the desktop technology. For instance, PHP is a scripting language, and let's say C# or Visual Basic, it's a programming language. So meaning that these programming languages, they have got a set of compiler. A program is being compiled before it runs, and also a very easily identifiable difference between the two. You will find out for any desktop application, you must have a setup for it, but for a scripting language like PHP script, you don't necessarily install an application. So that is the difference. So this means that in the response request cycle in scripting language, you've got the UI that sends the request to the server, and the server will respond. This is the fundamental of a web-based application. That's how it happens. You send a request and the server will respond to the user interface based on the type of request. Just like the needle that moves up and down in one direction, I would like to say that's how also the request response happen. Meaning that you can only push, when you push the needle up, you can only hook like one thread at a time. Just like the response request cycle in the web based architecture, in that request you can only send one request at a time. If I'm logging in, I'm pressing the login button, I must take the information from the user interface using JavaScript, and I must take it to the server, and the server needs to process that information and then send it back to me. So it happens that way. Even if you might be using an application that looks like sophisticated or complicated, and it might give you an impression that everything happens at once, but be aware that it happens in a request response cycle. So now I want to explain in detail, putting what I've said into context of an application, as we are going to develop a school management system. So I want to show you that journey on how are we going to structure our own mini framework, I can say, that will help us to manage efficiently and effectively the request response cycle. So how did I came about to really understand the idea of a mini framework in any app? As I was building my own accounting system, I realized that I was so slow than my own expectation. I didn't finish it like by the time that I anticipated, and also I felt like I was coding in circle. There was no progress. I felt some sort of stagnant at some point because I wanted to quickly finish it, but that was not happening. So when I was looking back, checking some analysis, what hinders my progress, I realized that I was progressing, but first I was busy, or the majority of my time was consumed by creating the mini framework, which is the request response cycle process or application, before I will create the accounting system, or I will create objects that relate to the accounting system itself. So to create a distinction, or to clearly some sort of explain to you this mini framework, if you take two developers, the one that will start the application from scratch and the one that will use Laravel as a PHP framework, you will find out that the one that is going to use Laravel as a PHP framework will be more faster than the one that will create everything from scratch, because Laravel is an MVC framework. It has got some sort of a foundation already built. So there is some sort of an application, which is Laravel, the framework itself. It takes care of how you make your request, how it processes it, and also how it brings it back to the user interface. Also, it has got some templating engine. Also, it has got some sort of pieces of code, classes that will help you with connecting to the database. But if you are starting everything from scratch, it will mean that you have to take care of all of that. So in doing so, if you are creating an application without being aware of a mini framework that you have to create, you might feel frustrated at some point, thinking that you are not progressing, whereas you are first laying the foundation. So in this school management system that we are going to create, we are going to start first by creating our mini framework. Obviously, it's gonna be reusable. It's something that we're gonna use also in other applications. So this diagram, number one, it's not gonna be easy to explain because I'm gonna talk about a lot of things, but I'm gonna try to be as slow and clear as possible, and I'm gonna make real life examples so that you can understand, because in this diagram I'm going to talk about also the objects, the creation of objects, and a lot of things. So let's get into it. So as you can see here, this is some sort of a visual representation of a request response cycle. Number one, what can we learn from this diagram? As you can see, I've got two types of arrows, the arrows going to the right and also the arrows going to the left, going back to the HTML layer. So now let's talk about the sections or the layers that we have. Number one, if you are interacting with a web application, you will interact primarily with the HTML part of it that has been styled by CSS. Hence we have this HTML part. So let's say you are pressing a button here, and then once you press this button, then there is a jQuery or a JavaScript behind that HTML that is listening for any action that is taking place in the HTML element. So if you've pressed the button, maybe there will be a function, let's say that button on click. That means when you click that button, then certain instructions will be performed. So once you click on that HTML, then the JavaScript, in our case is going to be jQuery, the JavaScript will listen for that click event when the button is clicked. After that, the jQuery will create an AJAX call to a server, and then once we get into a server, the first page or PHP script that is gonna receive that request is going to be the index file. So as you can see that there is no way that this jQuery can make an AJAX call to the app PHP file, or to the router PHP file, or lastly to the actual login PHP. So if this is a login HTML and there is a a button that you are clicking there to log in. It talks to the JavaScript, and the JavaScripts directly talk to what? To the index.php. So this is called a single point of entrance. Is it possible that this jQuery JavaScript can directly talk to this login button? Of course, that's how I started my own application. I had my JavaScript calling different parts or different scripts in the whole application, but however that didn't work for me very well because it didn't have some sort of a control, and my code was not clean, and it was not easy for me to extend that application. So let me give you a real life practical problem that might occur if you have your JavaScript files calling directly the corresponding PHP files. So if here we are saying in this HTML there is a login, that means obviously there is a click event for that login in the jQuery. But however, this JavaScript file doesn't call directly the login, the corresponding login file. So it must go through the indexed PHP. Let's say it was calling directly the login file. What will be the problem? Functionally, still your application will work, but in terms of maintenance and clean code, it will fail. How would it fail? So let's say that we have a login jQuery that calls a login file. At the same time, we've got let's say a code jQuery function that calls a corresponding PHP code file. Let's say going forward, we've got also a lot of JavaScript file. Let's say 15 of them. They are calling different corresponding PHP files. Now we want to implement a log out functionality. So this means that if I have logged out in one tab of the system, as you know, when you are using Firefox or Chrome or Opera Mini, you've got some tabs. So let's say that we've opened multiple tabs, 4 of them, and in those tabs, in the first tab, I log out. Are you expecting me to go to the second tab and continue with the application as usual? Obviously no. That's a big risk. That will mean if you forgot to log out in all the tabs, then that means somebody else, if you are at an internet cafe, can come and use your Facebook or whatever application, even though on the first one you have logged out. So what does that mean? It means that one single event for logging out, it must some sort of update the entire system. So even on the other tab, when you are clicking anything, if you have logged out on the first tab, it must tell you that the user is already logged out, or it must present a new login string. When you are going to the third tab, it must do the same thing. So how could we apply that here in this first planning or structure where all the jQuery files are communicating directly to the corresponding PHP files? It will mean that this jQuery that communicates to the login, when I'm in the login PHP, I need to validate, am I logged in, before I continue logging in. Then let's say I've got another jQuery file that query student names. So meaning that I have to go to that PHP file, the PHP that is responsible for handling a request for student names. I have to check on that file, am I logged in, before I process. Let's say I've got also like 10 to 15 or 50 jQuery files making different requests. As you might now, I think you might see this pattern that whenever button that you press, it always creates a request to the server to ask for something. So I've got 50 jQuery files that are making different requests. So that will mean in those corresponding 50 PHP files that handles those requests, I have to always have an instruction that check, am I logged in? So this will mean that number one, I will break the try principle. That means I will be repeating myself. The try principle, the DRY, stands for do not repeat yourself. So those are techniques for a clean code. So that means I will repeat that instruction in all the PHP files. So in all the PHP file, I have to put an instruction that validates, am I logged in, before I continue. However, to solve that problem, I can create a single point of entrance to my business logic or to the server, which is going to be the index page. So the index page serves as a gatekeeper. Every request from the user interface passes through the index page. So the index page, if I can put only one code here on the index page that validates, am I logged in? Yes. If I'm logged in, then I can start to create new objects and get data and whatever. But if I am logged out, then it will take me to the login screen again. So how many times am I gonna validate if I'm logged in? I can only validate once on the index page, like in index PHP file, only once, because I know all my requests are pointing directly to the index page. However, in the case of the application that we're gonna create, we are not going to validate on the index page. We are going to delegate that responsibility to the router, the routing class. We're gonna talk about that later. So as you can see that we are going to start from the HTML, go to the corresponding jQuery or JavaScript, and then the JavaScript to an AJAX call is going to point to index.php. Now let's get into the server side or the backend. In the index.php, we're going to create a new object of an application, of an app. That means there will be a corresponding class app. And then this object will have to, this class application will receive dependencies. What are dependencies? Dependencies are other classes that are used by other classes. For instance, the class application will receive a router as a dependency. It's a class, but this app is gonna use the router. So the relationship between the class app and the router, this class app has a router. There is also another type of relationship between classes, which some sort of it's inheritance, where class app is a router. However, as you can see that the names are different. So the application is not a router, but it has a router because it will use a router. So what we do, we create a class of application, and this class will receive a router as a dependency. However, the router also has got a dependency that it will need, and that dependency, it's a dependency injection container. It's a class that acts as a factory. It manufactures all the classes that we will need, whether the classes for routing, the classes for rendering views, the classes for courses, the classes for student, the classes for querying, whatever, results and displaying results in form of a PDF. All those classes are going to be created, are going to be newed up in the dependency injection container, the DI container. One might name this class, the DI container, as a factory. That will mean they are adhering, or they are taking that concept from a factory pattern in one of the design pattern. But for now, I decided to name this this class as a dependency injection container, because I wanted it, number one, to be meaningful, and also so that when using it, you can really understand the functionality of this class, that it's a container, it contains a lot of dependencies. So let's just talk about the dependency injection container. So this means that whatever class that we are going to create, it might be on a separate file, on a different location, but it's gonna be created inside the dependency injection container. So the dependency injection container will contain all the classes that we're gonna need, so that when we need them in a certain step of the application, since the router has the dependency injection container, it's gonna take that container and it's gonna use it. So the router is gonna use a dependency injection container. The dependency injection container will create those objects for us. Any dependency that we'll need, it will be created there. It's not gonna be declared there because it might be declared as a class somewhere. We might have downloaded the, like for instance, the FPDF library, and we're gonna put it under vendors in our folders. So that means it's already there as a class. But when we are creating a new instance of it, we must have one place where we are newing up object, and that will be the dependency injection container. Now let's just go 2 steps backward. Here we've got an application inside index. We've got an application. We're creating a new app, a new object, new instance of an application. It will take router as a dependency. The router will take the dependency injection container as a dependency, and then from then we move on to the next step. Then we are moving on to the app PHP file. That means actually in this class, this is an instance of a class. Now we are in that class. So in that class we've got app. This is a spelling mistake. This is not supposed to be appr, it's supposed to be app. So we are in the app class. So the app class has a router. What is a router? A router is a class that is responsible for taking the request from the user interface from this side, and also it channels it to the corresponding PHP class or PHP file based on the request. If here on HTML we were having a login file, we have clicked logged in. So the router will take all that information, the desired destination file, it's login.php, and these are the parameters, or this is the data that it will need, and then it will take that and route it to, or channel it to, the corresponding page, a PHP page or PHP class according to the request. So when we are here, the app has a router. So it's the router that is going to decide what type of a request and which file must I direct this request to. And then from then here, what is the function, the main function of an app, or what are the functions that are going to be performed in this app class instead of just calling a router. So this app class, one of the functions that it will do, which I believe it's important or it's worth mentioning, from this app class going this side, these objects that I'm creating here, whatever that I'm doing, they don't have a right to output anything. They don't have a right to render an HTML string and display it in terms of echo and echo it and print it out. They don't have that right, meaning that the app application stands as a gatekeeper between the HTML and all other classes that are after it or at the back of it. So it means that whatever that I will be doing this side on the router, when I'm done with that information, I need to return that information as it is, so that the app can take that response and renders an HTML page, because the app can render an HTML page because it is closer to the HTML request or the HTML, the user interface side. So it's the one that is some sort of attached to HTML, so it has got the responsibility of rendering the HTML. So these classes and these files, they are not allowed to render the HTML. So let me make an example why they are not allowed to render an HTML. It's like I'm giving control to an app. As soon as the app application let other files behind it, or after it render some HTML file, you will find out that this app now will lose control. When this request comes back, the app is not sure what has been rendered, because maybe the router decided to display user not found. So what the app will do, it will take that response user not found and channels it to the HTML to display it. As much as an application, when the user is not found, it knows what to do. Maybe it terminates the program, or it will display a different message. But however, because these classes at the back of it has gotten access to rendering HTML or to displaying output, then you will find out that you will have two messages: the one that comes to the router saying file not found, and the other one that comes from an app to say that incorrect address. So that will be the first problem. That means we have broken the single responsibility principle, meaning that now the router has got two responsibilities, and that's a problem, and that will slow down your maintenance or the debugging your code. If a class has got multiple responsibilities, a router has to be very efficient and intelligent on routing, not on displaying information to the HTML or echoing up statements. That's going to be a big problem. So that means we are taking that control and we are delegating it to the application. So anything that will be rendered to the HTML, it will be done here. So this means that now we are sticking to the solid principle, the S of the solid principle, that the app is the only one that will render things to the HTML so that it can be in control. This will make sure that these classes, each of these classes, they are just doing what they are supposed to do. They won't be rendering information whereby now when we are responding to that request, you'll find out that we've got different things that have already been rendered without the application, without this class app being aware of that. So we need to delegate that control to the app. It has to decide. Now let's take an example, the login example that we're saying. If I am a login request, what am I hoping to get back? Am I hoping to get back an HTML, a list of, let's say, courses, a list of users, or I'm interested on knowing whether is this user present or not present? That means, is the authentication valid or not valid? Is this user like a true user or a false user? So you can see that the login request is only interested on making a decision. It doesn't want to really display information like a list of users. So it's not like querying information or asking for information, but it's only asking for true or false. So when it sends a request through jQuery, it will specify on the parameters, on the Ajax parameters, that I'm interested on getting a true or false. That's my own interest. So if this jQuery receive a true or false, when it's false, it will know what to display on the HTML. When it's true, it will know what to do. That means you must load the dashboard or the admin panel because the user is correct, it's not a fake user, or the password and the username, they match. So do you see that this login screen or button, or the request, the login request, is only interested on true or false? So when it gets to the application and it gets to the router, and also that goes to the router, and the router calls in the login.php to authenticate, that login PHP doesn't have to display that information. It has to return that Boolean value to the router, and the router will bounce that Boolean value back to the app. Then the app will decide what to do with the Boolean value. Remember, this is PHP. So a Boolean value which is true in PHP, maybe it might not be understood by jQuery. As I've told you that HTML and jQuery are more of front end, they are more of user interface, mockup language and a scripting language. They are more on the front end, and there is a wall between the front end and the back end in PHP. So these are different languages. So if you can take that boolean value, that true, from PHP and send it back to this, usually the jQuery as JavaScript language might not catch that true, because remember this the PHP engine, how it creates its own data type and how it some sort of manufacture its own data type as a boolean, it's quite different from JavaScript. So you can't expect JavaScript to understand a boolean from PHP. You can't expect C# to understand JavaScript's boolean PHP. If that was the case, then it will mean that I can take a C# code and use it on PHP, because PHP processes a boolean exactly in terms of the technology and the bits and pieces of it exactly the same way as PHP. Obviously, abstractually, if there is such a name, in terms of abstract, they look like they are doing the same thing, because in JavaScript you will find conditions, true or false. On C# you will find condition. Even on PHP you will find condition, you will find boolean variable. But the building blocks of those variables, these programming languages are different. They create those variables differently. So if here you can bounce a boolean value for PHP, sending it to JavaScript will miss it because it doesn't understand it. So what does it mean? It means that the relationship between a JavaScript the difference between JavaScript and also PHP, or the channel of communication or the contract between JavaScript and PHP, is that the PHP must return to JavaScript strings only. So it means that the jQuery might understand a string from PHP, but it might not understand a certain data type from PHP. I hope this makes sense, but if it doesn't make sense, you can comment below and then tell me that okay, something doesn't make sense, can you explain in detail? So meaning that whenever, so the app class has got a responsibility to take the native communication and meaning of PHP. What does a boolean mean in PHP? It must convert it to a corresponding string so that jQuery can understand. So it means that if this login class passes by a boolean value saying true, that means the password and the username, they match, then the app must take that true, and then it must then say, okay, if this is true, then let me render a string true and send it back to jQuery. Usually in most cases the communication, usually the user interface and the back end, when they are communicating, there is a file called a JSON file or a JSON string. I will talk about that later in a separate video. Usually the platform in which these layers communicate, they communicate through JSON file. So meaning that JSON string. So meaning that a PHP file can send a JSON string to jQuery, and the jQuery can send a JSON string to the PHP file. But however, as long as it's a string. So meaning that when I receive as an application on PHP a boolean value true, that means this user is successful, they can log in. I must convert that to a string true so that I can send it to jQuery. jQuery or JavaScript can understand a string true, and then if that string is true, then it will do this. If that string is false, string false, not a data type, string false, then it will do something else. You might depending on your choice, it might, to you it might not be a string false, it might be success or fail, however the case may be. But to me, I like consistency across all my layers. If this returns true, then even this layer must test for true even if it's a string. So that will be one of the responsibilities of the app class. So it's not just there to instantiate a new router, but also it will do some sort of a lot of things, but not different, not overlapping, not the work that is supposed to be done by the router is supposed to be done by something else, but all the functions that will relate to it. So I think we are done with the application. Then now we are here in the router. So the router will use a dependency injection container, a DI container. Why is it going to use a DI container? Remember, it doesn't have a right to instantiate object. It doesn't have a right to create object. So it will ask for those objects from the dependency injection container because it has it. So the app has the router in it has a dependency container, a dependency injection container as a dependency so that it can use it. So it means that now the router, when it wants to use, not to create, not to instantiate, to use a login class, it's not going to create a new login, a new instance of it, but it's going to take the dependency injection container and ask for login get instance, which is a function that will be a method that will be inside the dependency injection container. So once it uses that method, it will get an instance of login, and then it will, like some sort of use a function inside that class login. For instance, let's say inside this class login there will be a function or a method validate user that will take the user password and the username. So as you can see, obviously this is a little bit complicated. I do understand. If you feel like something is confusing, please comment below and tell me, okay, this is what I want you to explain. But this is a journey of a request response cycle. However, different developers have got like different approach, and also so there are many ways to go about it, but here I'm giving you my own thinking, or how am I gonna go about it in creating the school management system. However, as you can see, this has got nothing to do with the school management system yet, but it's a framework. So when I landed into this type of thinking, remember at the moment in time I know nothing about Laravel and I haven't used Laravel. I only learn about Laravel on other YouTube videos when other people are talking about it. Maybe they are talking about design patterns that are used in Laravel and factory patterns and whatever. So that's what I know about Laravel. So I haven't used Laravel yet, and for a reason. I don't feel like I'm sort of ready to use Laravel. I want to know the bits and pieces of like coding, like PHP as a scripting language. I want to know a lot first about PHP before I learn Laravel, so that I can understand what's the importance of Laravel, so that I can manipulate Laravel to work for me, instead of just religiously using Laravel without really having full control over it. So as I was getting into this paradigm, to this certain way of thinking, understanding that there is a mini framework in every web app, and that mini framework you can use it into, you can use in another application, because it doesn't contain classes about, let's say, accounting, or classes about fleet management that are specific in a certain problem domain, but it's just a structure that is always there. So this is, I would like to assume, this is what Laravel provide for developers. It takes care of all of, more especially this section in this yellow box or yellow square. This part, as you can see, that number one, it concentrates on, it handles the response request cycle, the efficiency. Where do you create your dependencies? Where do you manufacture your dependencies? Do you have your dependencies running around all over your app? When you want to create a new object, you just say new what, new what, and then now when you want to maintain that application, you find out you have got to look all over the place, you see. But now here in this some sort of mini framework, I've got a dependency injection container that creates new objects for me. So what if now, instead of creating let's say I'm creating a new student class, but this student, now the parameters have changed. So that means when I'm creating it, it also like takes like different parameters. That will mean I'm gonna change it only in one place inside the dependency container, in that get instance, get student instance, and then that's where I will change, and then I will pass it as some sort of a different instance. But however, the class that will be using that instance is not aware of that, and it must not be aware of it. What it will do, it will take the instance and use it. So that will help in terms of maintenance. Also, a little bit about the dependency injection container, why it is there. You will find out that when you are creating a new instance that takes a dependency, the dependency that you are injecting might call for other 2 more dependencies. That means it will need dependencies. So those 2 dependencies might call for 4 more dependencies. So if we can create in the router, we can create, let's say, an instance of a login that has got dependencies, multiple dependencies, let's say it's 5 of them, then you will find out that the routing class, it's becoming cluttered. It has got a lot of code, let's say 25 lines of code, and those lines of code have got nothing to do with its responsibility, but everything to do with trying to new up objects or trying to new up instances, of which in terms of the single responsibility and also the clean code, your code won't be clean, because when I get into the router class, I must first see 25 lines of code of the developer trying to organize dependencies, trying to do the dependency management aspect of the application inside the router. So for me, it's better, or it's a good programming practice, to have a container that will specialize on organizing all the dependencies. For instance, let's say I'm inside the dependency injection container. If the login needs another instance, then I've got that method in the dependency injection container. If the dependency is validate, it's a class called validate, I will just say get instance, the get validate instance. Maybe the validate instance need another injection, I will just get all those methods. Do you see that the dependency injection container won't struggle to inject dependencies because it specializes on that? So that's the reason why there is a dependency injection container. So as you can see that we have moved from this part to this part to this part to this part. Now we are here on the login. Obviously the login is not going to be the one again querying to the database and checking if is the user validated, is it true or false or whatever. It's not going to do that. There is a class still that will do that, that will handle that responsibility, and that library, or some sort of a mini library, it's Philantro. So in this school management system, I'm going to try to create like things from scratch. But however, obviously there are those things that I am not going to create from scratch, like for instance the FPDF for generating PDF. So that one is gonna be a library that is a free library that I'm gonna download, and I'm just gonna use as it is. But Philantro, it's my own library that I've developed, and then it helps me with connecting to the database. So instead of, if I want to, let's say I want to check if the username and the password match, inside Philantro there is a method called, let's say, validate user. Then I will pass in the username, I will pass the password, then it will just bring back the correct username. So one of the problems that I encountered before is that the library, or my class Philantro, didn't like adhere to the single responsibility principle. So it was echoing statements. Let's say if the user is not authenticated, it will echo a statement fail. If it's true, it will echo a statement successful, and at the same time it will return true. So echoing, displaying a statement on screen, and returning a value are two different things, and they can happen at the same time. So there was a point whereby in the HTML I saw successful, and I was asking myself, where is this successful coming from? So meaning that I had to trace down in this process, where is this success coming from, until I realized that my class Philantro has broken the single responsibility principle in solid principle. It was not doing one thing. So now I've refactored that class. What it does, it returns the boolean value, and that's it. And also important to note, very, very important to note, not only the app class is responsible for echoing, for rendering the HTML so that it can be captured, let's say by the jQuery, or for rendering strings. Also, it has got the responsibility for terminating the script. All these apps, all these classes that are going to be instantiated by the dependency injection container, they must not have the right to terminate the application. That will be a flaw or a disaster, because remember, when the app is instantiating a router, giving it parameters from the request, from the UI request, it's expecting a response, because it's a request response cycle. Now if somewhere down in these dependencies the Philantro class for some reason decided, when the user is not, when the password and the username don't match, it decides to die, to use the instruction die in PHP, that means it's saying that it must stop the execution and just return to the calling module, of which now when it returns here without giving the app the information, it becomes a problem. So I'm trying to say, in your own coding or in your own app, you must know which class is responsible for terminating the script and even exiting a certain script. So you must not just be quick to die because of you don't want the program to continue. That must be the responsibility of the app to do that, because if you do that, you will find out that on the user interface you might find blank responses. You don't know why, because somewhere in the chain or deep down in your app, a certain class, after a certain error has occurred, it has terminated the whole execution. So and then it just ends there, and now it returns blank because you've just terminated, you've just said it must stop here, and then it returns blank. So also this class has got a responsibility for terminating. It's only this class, the app class, that has got a responsibility to terminate the execution based on the response from all other classes. However, this will make a full sense when we are getting into the actual implementation. And then from then, as you can see, that we started with the login page here, and then this is the corresponding login file. Even this corresponding login file is not going to be here. The router is not going to communicate directly to the login file. No, it's going to ask for that instance in the dependency injection container. But here I have put it here just for illustration and the request response flow. So once we have reached login will do whatever and return a message to us, to this router, to this app, to this to this jQuery, and then up to the HTML. I hope first you can see that how the response request cycle happens, what's going on in there. So whenever you think about pressing a button, whenever you think about requesting something from the server, you must always think about this request response cycle. It's like that needle. It goes there, it hooks a thread, it comes back with a thread. That is it, nothing more, nothing less. And also it can only process one request at a time. One request at a time. The other thing that is worth mentioning in this school management system is going to be a single single page application. At the moment, I am not interested in multiple web application. I don't like application that that does a page refresh. For instance, where there will always on the address bar there will be student management system / login, username Matthew, password, and then when you click enter it will refresh the whole page. And then I really don't like those apps, and even at the moment I haven't designed an app like that. I've seen them in videos and also even in academic websites for registration, but in this but one and also the other ones that I did, I'm interested in single page app. Where did I got that, or where is the interest coming from? The interest comes from using a WhatsApp web application. When you log into WhatsApp web application, you will find out that it behaves as an like a mobile application, so I like that feeling. I like that presentation. When it refreshes all the time, to me it then feels like a normal website, but an intelligent one or a smart one. However, maybe there might be reason why people like the, let's say, the refreshing app, the apps that always refresh, and also the apps that use a get method to send parameters to the server. Also, it might happen is because of the frameworks. Maybe let's say a certain framework has been structured that way, so you have to follow that. But I was highlighting that this one is going to be a single page app. It means that once it loads, once the address bar, there will be school management system, then the address bar won't change. All the components and sections of the HTML page will change, and the app will continue and work as usual, but the address bar is not going to change multiple times and show you get what and whatever. Otherwise, for me, Matthew Msingati, I hope this is helpful. I hope you are learning something from this video. If there is anything that is confusing, please comment below and tell me that I didn't understand this, or I didn't get you when you are talking about this, what you mean about this, so that me and you can both learn together. Otherwise, for me, that's it. If you feel like this video has added an overall control of your own PHP knowledge and understanding, please subscribe.